Okay, this is a quick little overview of doing some MIDI, MIDI note control, MIDI show control, and a little bit of LTC time code in Vista. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with I have a cue list that I previously made, has some cues in it. If I play through it, I can see some of the things happen. Let me start that again. Let me go back to the beginning. Okay, welcome. This is a quick little overview of doing some MIDI, both MIDI notes, MIDI show control, and a little bit of LTC in Vista. So to start off, I have a cue list that's been pre-made. It has some cues in it, just basic stuff, things like lights come up, light and change color and do their thing and then go off. Uh, this is a cue list I want to control from another MIDI device, and I'm going to use MIDI notes to control this cue list. So to do that, I have to start with a couple different things. So first off, what I want to do is I need to check my cue list properties and my MIDI tab, and I'll have to assign notes to these. So to start off, I'm going to remove all the notes I already have previously assigned and say OK. So now there's no MIDI note assigned to this. Next thing I have to do is I have to go to my user preferences and say which device is going to send MIDI into Vista right now. So in the user preferences under MIDI, I have different columns here: MIDI show control, device IDs, MIDI timecode IDs, MIDI note channels. You can have multiple different channels. I would just leave this as any channel because usually you only have a single MIDI sender. And in this bottom part of the screen is where I select which device is going to send MIDI to Vista right now. I have lots of things attached to my computer for this demo. In this case, what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to be working with this one device, the Korg Nano Control 2. So this is a MIDI device that's connected via USB, and shows up directly in here as an external MIDI port. So I say okay. Now I have to assign this. So here, let's bring this over here real quick. This is the device that I have. I have this as a piece of hardware. And on this device, I have some buttons down here. And I've assigned these buttons to these different MIDI notes. So my play is a note F2. This would be a release, and this would be a play and release. I can make these whatever notes I want, but this is just what I've assigned to this. Now in my cue list properties, I have to assign those notes that were on that device to these actions. So play, release, and flash. I can use the drop down and I could select the note this way. However, I often don't like to do that because maybe my note is off a little bit and I'm not a music guy, so I don't know that. The other reason is when I use this learn function, it actually helps me verify that Vista's hearing MIDI. So in this case, I hit the learn button and now it's waiting for me to play the MIDI note. In this case, I will hit my play button on my hardware control. And you can see it immediately grabbed that note and locked it in. I do the same thing with the release. I'll hit another button. There's my release. Play and release. Hit button. There's that. And lastly, on the flash, I hit my other little button. And now I have the notes locked into my MIDI, my cue list. I say OK on that. And if I were to go back to the beginning, and on my hardware device, I'm going to push this button right here, which is going to send the F2 note to Vista, and it's going to play that cue. And now I hit it again, it's going to play the next cue. And again for the next cue. If I hit this button on the hardware, it releases all my cues. I could play through again and release. And if I hit my button over here, the play and release, it's going to play into that cue. The first press plays into the cue. The second press releases it. So that's handy for a single cue list if you just want something to come on and then go off. And then finally, the flash button here. The flash isn't going to show me anything right now because what will happen is if I have played into my cue, I have something up. So in order for me to have flash do something, I would have to go and turn my fader down. And now when my fader is down, this button over here is a flash, and it's going to kick those lights on and off for me. Again, it'd be helpful with a single cue list. So that's some basic MIDI control, MIDI note control in Vista. That's the way you do that. It's pretty simple. It's straightforward. Also, it's important to note that when I have a MIDI controlled cue list in a playback, I get this little icon on the playback that says it looks like a MIDI connector. So it's going to show me, hey, there's my MIDI. So I have a couple of different cue lists on here that have MIDI in them right now. So next thing I'm going to show is using MIDI show control. And also up here at the top, I have this button that I've put in. It's out of the tools menu, MIDI show control. This is a toggle. This would toggle on and off the MIDI functionality of Vista, whether it's on or if it's off. If it's off like this, MIDI notes or MIDI show control won't come through. And if it's on, I'll get all that information. I'm going to open up another Q list here. We're going to do QLab MSC. So this is a Q list that I made. It actually has no content in it for lights. It's just showing cues. And it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's copied down through here. What I've done with this Q list is I've created a show in QLab that has MIDI show control messages in it. And in those show control messages, it says play list 10 Q1 or Q3 or Q6. Those are the different messages I put in it. So I have to enable this to be played. So first off, I make sure that that's on. And then I also have to do another thing. Because I have a PC, I had to use another program in order to bring MIDI over the network from my other machine into Vista. If I'm in a Mac, I don't need to do this. Mac does this natively. If I'm in PC, I have to use another program. And that program is called RTP MIDI. So this is kind of a clone of the exact program you would see on a Mac, the native MIDI over network screen on a Mac. So in this case, I have that running on I have the network on the Mac running. It's connected to this machine, and this is the session that it's running. So that other computer is seeing this, and it's outputting its MIDI over the network to my session here. And then my session here is what I have enabled in my user preferences under MIDI right here. I could name that something else if I wanted to see it a little more clearly. But in this case, I know what that is, so that's what I'm going to be listening to. So now over on my Mac, on my QLab machine, my first MIDI cue in QLab is to play Q1 of list 10. My next cue is to play Q3, and then play Q6, and then I have one to play Q2. So these are show control messages. They're not MIDI notes, so I don't have to. I'm not just hitting the play button over and over again. I'm specifically saying play this cue from this list. I could mix and match if I wanted to. I could play cues from other lists. I don't have to stay on the same list. I could be playing things from all over the place. The thing you have to watch out for that is when I'm playing a list, I'm making it active. It would have to be released if I don't want it to contribute to the output on the stage, or you want to make sure nothing else is, or only one cue is running at a time. But that's what this does, is RTP MIDI is going to take that information over the network and bring it into here to let me do this. RTP MIDI also works for any MIDI over network. So even if I were to run MIDI notes from another machine, in this case, my MIDI notes are coming from a local device that's attached directly to this machine. But if I have another program or another system somewhere else that's outputting MIDI and I want to output it over the network, I need to use this RTP MIDI. If I have two PCs, I would need to use RTP MIDI on both machines. If I have a Mac and a PC, like I do right now, I only need this on the PC. And if I have two Macs, I don't need this at all. All right, so next I'm going to show running MIDI notes from another software on the same machine. So in this case, I'm using ProPresenter. ProPresenter has the functionality of adding a MIDI note to a slide. So in this case, I have taken the ProPresenter demo and I added a MIDI note to this slide that would play my cue list, another one of this to play, here to play, here, and here. I'm going to set that off to the side for a moment. I'm going to open up my cue list that matches that. So in this case, I've got a cue list here called Good Grace. It matches this cue list here, or these slides here. And again, because I have multiple things going on, I have to change my MIDI interface. In this case, I'm going to change my MIDI interface to something called Loop MIDI Notes. So this is a device, this is another piece of software that's in Vista, or not in Vista. This is another piece of software that I have downloaded to loop the MIDI from one program to another program. Let me open that up. So this is loop MIDI right here. So what this allows me to do is it allows me to take MIDI and output from one software package and send it to another software package. In this case, I have two different ports that I made. This one I'm going to use next. This one I'm using right now, the Loop MIDI Notes. And in Pro Presenter, I have made the output of these slides to go, or the output of this MIDI to go to the Loop MIDI Notes. And then on the input of Vista, I've come in here and under MIDI, I have changed this to Loop MIDI Notes is where I'm going to listen to this. So with that, now I should be able to play this slide. And when I enable this slide, it's going to play that note. And it's going to play my first cue. And if I continue to play through things here, it's going to play my next slide. My next slide is going to play my next cue. Nothing's going to happen for the next one because I didn't put a note in that one. I go to chorus, and it's going to play the next one. I could play through my chorus lines, hit my verse 2, and on down, and then hit the bridge. What's important to realize is that this is playing a note. This is just hitting play, just like if I was hitting this play button here. So if I'm here in this first cue, in this first slide, and I click this slide again to enable the slide again, it's going to resend that same note, and it's actually going to play into my next cue. So this is something to remember, that if you're playing notes through here, you want to make sure you're staying through here, or else you could get yourself out of sync. And again, if I was, right now I'm using both Pro Presenter and Vista on the same machine, which I don't recommend doing. But for this demo, I have to use Loop MIDI to make that happen. If I had Pro Presenter and Vista on separate machines, I wouldn't use Loop MIDI. I'd actually be using what I was using earlier there, the RTP MIDI. And here I would connect to this session over RTP MIDI over the network. That would be the simplest way of doing it. I could output straight up MIDI 5-pin DIN and back in the Vista, but that would be a little overly complicated. Okay, so the next thing I want to show is bringing LTC into Vista. And this is the method of doing LTC if you don't have a piece of Vista hardware that has a dedicated SMPTE LTC input on it. The EX does not have one, the MVs, the M1s. If you have an older S1, there's a current generation S1s that did not have one. If you had an older S1 or an S3 or an L5 console, i3 console, they all have dedicated LTC inputs that you can run directly into. If you don't have that, or if you're using a computer and you just want LTC directly into a computer, this is the method of how we could do that for bringing that in. So the first thing we need to do is we open up a timecode window. We can go to our settings of the timecode. It's set to internal by default. I want it to be MIDI. LTC is what I'd go to if I'm bringing it into the dedicated LTC port of a console. I would do LTC. But in this case, what I'm doing is we're going to bring it in to the computer as LTC. There's going to be another program in the background that's going to convert it to MIDI timecode, MTC, and that's going to then be output into Vista as the source. So in this case right now, I've got nothing there. It's going to turn red because there's no incoming source. And I'm going to use this piece of software called LTC Reader Converter. In this piece of software, I can set up and say what my source is and what my output is. So in this case, my source is LTC. My output is MIDI. I also have to go in and say, where is this? Where is this physically coming in? So in my preferences, I would open this up, and I have this Scarlett audio interface attached to my machine. And on this interface, I'm running LTC directly into that line in, and then it's going to output the MIDI to this output port. Again, this applies right back to Loop MIDI. So here is my Loop MIDI port TC. So I'm going to this port here. And once that's set, I can say okay there. We'll move this off to the side. And then back in my user preferences, I'm going to look at MIDI, and I'm going to change this, and we're going to use the loop MIDI port TC. It's possible to use all the same port. I could be running this on the same port. I just have it separated so that I can see the way each thing works individually. But I could run both MIDI notes and timecode down the same port. When I have that set, I say okay. And now on my MIDI sending device, or my LTC sending device, I'm actually using an app on a phone. It's set as just doing time of day clock, so it's not really anything special. So I'm just going to see that right now I started my time code. It's running here. This is the waveform. So as I adjust the volume, the incoming volume, you'll see this change here. The thing with the square wave of time code is if you have too much volume, it can cause it to stop. If you have not enough volume, you can cause it to stop. And pretty much what I like to do is I usually run it to where I can stop it either way and then pick a spot in between. In this case, I can't really make it stop either way. So I still want to try to pick a nice little spot in between where it's not overdriven or not too low. And we can see that here's the incoming time code, and Vista's picking it up, and it's running right here. If I have a list that's set to time code, it would play through things. Now, this list I previously made because it had time code stamps on it already. But as I play through this, it would fire each of these cues at the time that it needs to be. And that's a quick example of how to get LTC into Vista. Again, this is different for a Mac. Right now, in a Mac, there's another program made by the same company that makes QLab. It's called Lockstep. It does the same thing. The benefit to doing this on a Mac versus a Windows machine is Lockstep will show up directly in Vista as a device in the MIDI tab of the user preferences. You don't need to use loop MIDI on a Mac because Macs have better built-in MIDI processing. And that's a little bit about MIDI, how to do some MIDI notes, MIDI show control, and some external LTC timecode.